Hi, I'm Aubrey Hirsch. I'm a fiction writer, essayist, and comics artist. My work has appeared in places like the New York Times, Time Magazine, American Short Fiction, Black Warrior Review, the Florida Review, Third Coast, and elsewhere. I'm also the author of a short story collection called Why We Never Talk About Sugar. A lot of the stories in my collection are speculative, and whenever I'm giving readings or doing events, I would say the question that I get asked most often is, where do you get your ideas? Everyone is looking for inspiration. So that's what I want to talk to you about today: inspiration in speculative fiction. A fiction writer in search of a story is often given the advice that you should write what you know. And while that advice can be incredibly helpful for writers of domestic realism, it might leave a writer of imaginative, fabulous, or otherworldly stories thinking, well, wait, I want to write something that is outside of anyone's experience, let alone my own. So, how do I find ideas for that? I'm going to talk to you first about some places where you can look for inspiration for speculative stories, and then walk you through an exercise that's helped me write some of my favorite pieces. And then once you have your idea in mind, I'm going to talk you through some next steps for turning inspiration into a working draft. And I'm going to talk a bit about how I've put these techniques to use in my own work. Let's start by talking about some of the ingredients of a great speculative story to help us recognize a good idea when we come upon one. Of course, a compelling concept is fundamental. Part of the pleasure of reading speculative fiction is experiencing something that is wholly new and original, something that surprises us and motivates us to keep reading. But you'll also want to balance this out with some grounded elements that feel familiar and recognizable to the audience. This can help build empathy between your reader and your characters because there's at least some things that they have in common. It's this dance between the strange and the familiar that makes speculative fiction so special. Another important ingredient in speculative fiction is the world itself. You might get inspired by a possible change to reality, for better or for worse. Remember that any change you make to the world as we know it, however small, will have cascading effects. The more completely you can think about the world of the story, the more convinced your reader will be by it. Finally, a great speculative story absolutely requires tension and stakes. A good idea will have the potential for real, life-changing drama. When you're searching for inspiration, remember that the strangeness of the world you build won't be as important as the human emotions and interactions that happen within it. So, where can we look for inspiration for speculative stories? One place is other speculative stories. Many writers have been inspired by classic fables, fairy tales, and myths. Kelly Link is a great example of this. In an interview with the Rumpus, she talked about being inspired by the sense of justice that's present in many fairy tales that are told to little kids. She said that, quote, fairy tales are a populist form. They grant power and wealth to deserving characters, sometimes, and they punish characters who are greedy or who behave poorly. Amber Sparks has also been inspired by stories from the past. She writes about Paul Bunyan in her story, The Monstrous Sadness of Mythical Creatures. She said she wrote this story because she was curious about what happens when a hero gets old or when a country moves past their tall tales. Robert Olin Butler wrote a short story cycle in which every story is inspired by a different headline from a supermarket tabloid. You can consider these tabloid papers to be sort of like our modern tall tales. The book is called Tabloid Dreams, and it contains some very brilliant stories whose titles are taken directly from the headlines themselves. For example, Titanic victim speaks through waterbed. Woman loses cookie bake-off, sets self on fire. Every man she kisses dies. And my personal favorite from the collection, jealous husband returns in form of parrot. Speculative writers are often inspired by their own travels and experiences. Karen Russell talks about being inspired to think about hauntings when she visited an Irish museum. George Saunders gained inspiration for a lot of the elements in his celebrated story, Sea Oak, from a carousel and a Hooters in his local mall. I'm going to talk about one more idea to transition us into our generative exercise, but I just want to take a moment to say that this list is certainly not exhaustive. Speculative fiction writers have been inspired by nature, religion, art, technology. I once even wrote a story inspired by a dream I had in which I was pregnant with an alarm clock. So inspiration can truly be anywhere. The last one I want to mention in detail, and it might sound counterintuitive, is that lots of speculative writers are inspired by news and events in the world around them. Stephen King's The Stand is a good example of this. King often talks about two news stories that jump-started the book for him. The first was a story about chemical warfare and its aftermath, and the second was about a chemical spill in Utah that killed a flock of sheep. Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale was inspired by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This saw a theocracy taking over the government and squashing the rights of women and girls, limiting education, imposing strict dress codes. Many of the things that we see brought to life in America in the novel are real things that took place elsewhere. This last one is also my personal favorite way to come up with ideas for speculative stories. I love to find real-life news stories and give them fabulous twists. So now I want to talk you through an exercise to help you discover a news item that will hopefully inspire a speculative story. And then we'll dive in some ways to flesh it out into a draft.
To begin this exercise, we need to find an unfamiliar place. Bring up Google Maps and zoom out to a large area. I'm going to start by looking at the whole United States of America. If there's a place that calls out to you, you can start there, or you can just click to zoom in randomly. I'm going to click into Colorado because I used to live there and I'm fascinated by the small, isolated mountain towns in the Rockies. Here's a place called Silverton. There's a small commercial area and a highway nearby, so I'm guessing there's a local paper or newsletter that I can find online. So I'm just going to Google the name of the town, the state, and news to see what pops up. The first result looks like exactly what I'm looking for, the Silverton Standard. There's a few local news stories here in the news tab, but the one that immediately grabs me is about the 80-year-old tradition of kids in Silverton selling rocks. Now that I have this first spark of an idea, I can go looking for more information about this tradition to help inform my story.
Small remote towns are great sources for strange stories because they often write about things that would get overshadowed by bigger news in a bigger city. Sometimes it takes a little trial and error and a bit of digging to find something that inspires you. If you aren't finding much in the first local paper, go back to the map, start over, and try again. Hopefully you found a news item that's really sparked some creativity for you. You have a cool concept in mind and you're excited to turn it into a story, but maybe you're not exactly sure where to go from here. My friends and family know that I get inspired by the news a lot, and people close to me will often send me news stories they think might light me up. And they usually do. But the hard part is taking that initial spark and trying to figure out how to use it as a jumping off point for a compelling narrative that can really put something new into the world. My dad once sent me a news clipping about a small lake in Russia that seemingly vanished overnight. It was such a strange and interesting thing to happen that I knew I had to jump on it. But it took me about 5 years to get from my dad's email to a complete draft of that story, which I called The Disappearance of Maliseet Lake. The concept itself was so intriguing, but it took me a long time to figure out that the actual story wasn't really about the lake disappearing, but about what happened next. That the characters in my story would start selling miracle grass that grew on the bottom of the lake bed to make up for the fact that their fishing-based economy had been destroyed overnight. I also had to populate my town with interesting characters, a fisherman's wife, an unpopular but dedicated town mayor, a busybody with bad ideas. And I had to think about what ultimately I wanted my story to say. What is it in us that craves proximity to strange and miraculous things, even as they're ruining people's lives? I'm going to lay out some next steps that have worked for me and many of my students to help you take your news item and turn it into a working story draft. And to do that, we're going to use the 5W questions that are often used by journalists to gather information to guide our drafting process. So the questions are who, what, when, where, and why. Let's start with who. So the who in our case is obviously going to be about character. Who is going to be experiencing the events in the story? Through whose eyes will we be seeing what happens? In my example of the kids selling rocks, I see several different opportunities for interesting points of view characters. There are the kids themselves, their parents, maybe a customer. Each of these people is going to have a different set of experiences within the story and a different attitude toward the events as they unfold. And of course, a different voice used when they relay the information to the reader. The story that I mentioned to you earlier that was inspired by my dream about being pregnant with an alarm clock is a story that I started out writing with a kind of collective point of view, a sort of here is a thing that happened to us all in the world. But I couldn't quite make the draft work that way. It was only when I realized that I needed a specific character who wasn't going through something emotional herself, but was watching her sister go through it, that I kind of started to understand what was going to make the story work. So if you're having trouble, a good exercise to do would be to try writing a paragraph in a few different characters' point of view, and then you can kind of see which one inspires you to keep going. Next up is the what, and the what is the plot. And here also is where we'll need to take our news story and give it a speculative twist. In my example about the rock sellers, there are a lot of what ifs I could apply here. What if these were space rocks that had fallen to Earth? What effect might they have on our planet? What if the kids discover that one of their customers is eating the rocks? What if the rocks are for some kind of ritual that's not going to be revealed until Act 3? This step often involves taking the real events and pushing them to a kind of logical extreme. As another example, I have a short graphic story called Survivors that was inspired by a news story that was sent to me by a friend. The real news story was about scientists recovering Neanderthal DNA from ancient bone fragments. Of course, that made me think about cloning and if a Neanderthal embryo could be created in a lab somewhere. And if it was, then they would need a person with a uterus to volunteer to carry it and give birth to the clone. And the story that eventually resulted from all of these chains of thinking was about this volunteer who agreed to carry this Neanderthal baby and her eventual choice to run away with the fetus still growing inside of her in an attempt to give that baby something of a normal life. So while my comic was inspired by a real-life news event, the resulting plot is clearly fantastical. The when and where, in our case, are, of course, about setting. If it's important to the plot, you can set your story in the same general location that your news item was set in. This would probably be a good idea for my example about the kids selling rocks, since the Rocky Mountains makes perfect sense for a story like that. But you can also move the place to somewhere more familiar to you so that you can fill it out with the kind of clear, specific details that can really help to ground a speculative story. You might also choose to move your story to somewhere different in service of the plot, like a populated city to maximize the danger of a strange new force, or onto another planet to make an otherwise ordinary story feel otherworldly. I wrote a story inspired by a news item about a circus whose promoters had abandoned it and pulled out their money. When I was plotting the piece out, I decided that it would be interesting if the town rallied around the circus to try to help them. And I thought a lot about different places where a traveling circus could stay, the homes of different people in the town, a strange hotel. But what I thought would be most interesting would be a prison. So I ultimately set the story in a small town that was about 5 miles away from an abandoned women's prison, just because I loved the idea of a wall of cells filled with clowns, tigers, acrobats, Arabian horses, strongmen, dancing chihuahuas. Last but certainly not least, and certainly not least difficult, is the why. The why is always a bit of a slippery concept in fiction. You want the central idea or the theme of your story to be present and clear to the reader, but never overly explained. You want to demonstrate that you have something to say, but also remember that there's pleasure in discovery, and you don't want to deny your reader a chance to feel clever by figuring it out on their own. The why of a story is often something I discover as I'm writing, rather than something that I have in my mind already fully formed at the beginning of a story. I try not to rely too heavily on theme to do all of the work in the story. I personally only feel like I've succeeded with a draft if the piece itself stands on its own as a compelling and entertaining series of events, with the theme simply adding a layer of meaning and a sense of completeness to the thing itself. But speculative fiction in general is a great mode for exposing absurdity in our lives, or exploring shame about the past, or anxiety about the future. Speculative fiction can be scared or scary, joyful or optimistic. If you find yourself at the end of your draft and still aren't sure exactly what you're trying to say, it's sometimes helpful to go back and examine some of the decisions you've made along the way. By looking at these things one by one, you can sometimes clarify what was pulling at you during the writing process. For example, you might go back and wonder, why this narrator? Why this day? Why this place? And once you have a sense of what was guiding your pen as you wrote, you can think about where it might be appropriate to push those ideas a little bit harder in your revision. I know this probably seems like a lot to do all at once to take your inspiration or idea into a draft. One of my very first fiction teachers, a fabulous science fiction writer named Maureen McHugh, she used to say that writing a story is like hitting a pitched ball, because you have to do 1,000 things all at once, and you have to do them all without thinking about any one of them. So if that sounds a bit intimidating, I recommend drafting in layers. Do a draft that's just about getting the events down on paper. What happens, and then what happens after that. Then you can do a draft that focuses on character, then a draft building out the place, a draft where you think about meaning, one where you look at language, image, dialogue, etc., until you've got everything going on all at once. And I'll offer you a strategy for getting started that I have stolen from some of my very favorite fabulous writers. I personally love a speculative story that starts out by just telling us what's strange as simply and straightforwardly as possible. Amy Bender's brilliant story, The Rememberer, begins like this. My lover is experiencing reverse evolution. I tell no one. I don't know how it happened, only that one day he was my lover, and the next he was some kind of ape. It's been a month, and now he's a sea turtle. Just straightforwardly tells you what's strange and interesting about the story and lets you go from there. Gwen Kirby has a fantastic story that doesn't even wait for the first sentence to give the game away. She lays it all out in the title, which is, shit Cassandra saw that she didn't tell the Trojans, because at that point, fuck them anyway. And I myself have a piece of flash fiction that reimagines the Pinocchio story as a trans narrative. And it starts out, now that Pinocchio is finally a real boy, he understands that what he really wants to be is a woman. So sometimes getting that first sentence down will lead you naturally to a second sentence. I hope you found these ideas about inspiration and this generative exercise helpful. I hope you feel like you have a good sense of some places you can go to look for inspiration for your speculative stories, and that you feel empowered to sit down with your ideas and spin them out into fully realized speculative stories. Thank you for watching, and happy drafting.